I'm Jerry Blackwell, President of the Truckee Donner Railroad Society, and I'd like to welcome you to the virtual tour of our Railroad Museum. The museum is located here in Truckee, California, on the west side of the depot in downtown Truckee. The hours are normally from 10 to 4 on Saturday and Sunday. However, during the pandemic, it is closed. So let's go right now and let's go in the museum and find out what it's like.
Hi, I'm Dan Cobb, one of the docents for the Truckee Railroad Museum. Today we're going to be doing a virtual tour of the Railroad Museum, which is located in a 1950s bay window caboose that ran on the Southern Pacific Line for many, many years. Our museum is organized chronologically from back to front, so we'll be starting today at the back of the caboose. The first of our three main sections in this museum has to do with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And as most railroad fans know, the Transcontinental Railroad was very important in the unification of the United States in the mid to late 1800s. And it ran from Sacramento to Omaha, Nebraska, over the Sierra at Donner Pass and through the town of Truckee. What a lot of people may not know is that the idea of building a transcontinental railroad was becoming quite popular among businessmen and politicians in the eastern U.S. as early as 1845, which was a year before the Donner Party, 3 years before California even became part of the U.S., and 5 years before California became a state. While it was a popular idea, there was no action by Congress for many, many years because of a disagreement between the northern and southern states over the route that would be taken. The southern states wanted to run it through what is now Arizona and New Mexico, and the northern states preferred a more northern route along the lines of what was eventually built. When the southern states seceded in 1861, that left the northern states in control of Congress, and they easily passed the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, which provided for the building of the railroad across its current alignment. It provided for the creation of two railroad companies, the Central Pacific starting from Sacramento and the Union Pacific starting from Omaha, Nebraska, which would build from either end and meet in the middle. It also provided for financing or funding of the railroad through the issuance of government bonds. These were 30-year railroad bonds, and the companies would be paid out of the bond proceeds for each mile of track that was built. So our exhibit here focuses on the Central Pacific and the building of the railroad across the Sierra over Donner Pass and through Truckee. It tells the story of Theodore Judah, the young railroad engineer who surveyed the route over Donner Pass, demonstrating that the railroad could be built with a ruling grade that was adequate for the locomotives of the day. In addition to surveying the route, Judah also made several trips to New York and Washington, D.C., lobbying for the creation of the railroad. And on one of those trips, which were done by ship and then across the Isthmus of Panama, he contracted yellow fever and died at the age of 37, so he never got to see his dream realized. We also tell the story of the Big Four, four Sacramento businessmen, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, who formed the Central Pacific, and managed the building of the railroad across the Sierra, and in the process became phenomenally wealthy and powerful men. We also have an elevation profile showing the grade as surveyed by Theodore Judah, and showing how the route was done with a ruling grade of less than 2%, which was quite an achievement considering that the railroad had to climb over 7,000 feet in about 60 miles from Sacramento to Donner Pass, and then drop 1,300 feet down to Truckee in less than 9 miles. In this part of the exhibit, we also have historical photos and information about a number of the points along the route: Sacramento, Rockland, Newcastle, Colfax, Gold Run, Truckee, Boca, and Promontory, Utah. The centerpiece of this exhibit is this diorama showing the building of tunnel number 6, which was the longest of 15 tunnels in the Sierra route, at over a quarter-mile long. Before we talk about the details of the construction here, a little context about who actually built the railroad. The Union Pacific, working from the east, had a ready supply of semi-skilled labor, mostly soldiers returning from the Civil War who had fought on both sides, and slaves who had been freed and were now looking for work. California, on the other hand, had a labor shortage. California was still a difficult place to get to, and what semi-skilled labor did exist in California was in high demand in the mines and agricultural development in the Central Valley. So the Central Pacific Railroad had a serious labor problem. And they solved that problem by bringing in workers from China. The Chinese workers turned out to be excellent railroad builders, and in fact in many ways superior to the Europeans, primarily because they didn't drink alcohol and they did boil their water for tea, which meant that they were much less prone to disease and hangovers. Coming back to the diorama, when the Central Pacific Railroad got to the pass, they were confronted with a quarter-mile block of solid granite. And knowing that it was going to be a lot of work with the tools of the day and a very slow process to drill through, the approach they took was to drill a shaft down from the center of the block so that they could work 4 sides or 4 faces at once, the 2 ends and 2 in the middle. And the process they went through day after day was to lower Chinese workers down the center shaft in baskets. The workers worked in teams of 3 with using a 6-foot steel drill bit and sledgehammers. So one man would hold the drill bit and the other 2 would take turns hitting with the sledgehammer. Obviously it was grueling work, dangerous, and very slow. With that operation, they drilled holes in the granite 2.5 inches in diameter and as much as 2 feet deep, filled that with black powder, lit a long fuse, ran back to the basket, and were hauled up to the surface by their workmates, hopefully before the blast went off. Then the next crew would be loaded into the basket, lowered down the shaft, and would clean up the debris from the blast, which would be hoisted up in the baskets. Then they would drill more holes and go through the whole process again. And of course all of this had to be coordinated so that no one was down in the hole whenever a blast went off. Even working the 4 faces, it was very slow work. And using black powder, their progress was about 14 inches a day across the four faces of the tunnel. Later on in the process, nitroglycerin was introduced, which was more efficient, both because it created a larger blast and because it didn't require quite as big of a hole, and they could drill more holes. But even with the nitroglycerin, their progress was limited to about 22 inches a day, and the entire process of building the tunnel took over 2 years. Tunnel number 6 is still there at the top of Old Highway 40, and you can see it by driving up Highway 40 to a parking lot just west of the pass, and you can actually look through the tunnel from the west portal. Alternatively, you can scramble up to the east portal from a parking area just below the Rainbow Bridge. Also part of the exhibit is this interactive display above the diorama, which includes a number of historical photos and maps. One of those maps shows the 2-mile tunnel known as the Big Hole that was dug mechanically in 1925 to provide a second track over the summit. The railroad used both the Big Hole and the original track around through the snow sheds and smaller tunnels to run traffic in both directions for many years until 1993, when declining traffic allowed them to abandon the original track through the snow sheds in Tunnel 6. To my left, we have a wall of photos showing operation of the railroad over the Sierra, particularly the challenges of keeping the tracks clear of snow during the winters. Initially, the Central Pacific used what are called bucker snow plows for snow removal. And a bucker snow plow is basically a big wedge on wheels pushed by as many as 10 steam locomotives. And the operation basically would be to build up a head of steam and momentum, slam the bucker into a snowdrift, and push snow out of the way until the whole operation came to a halt. And then back up, work up some momentum, and do it again, over and over again. It was very dangerous work and resulted in many derailments and injuries. In 1887 and 88, the railroad tried out several mechanical snow throwing machines, and the winner of that competition was a steam-powered rotary snow blower that had been designed by a man named Orange Jewell in Toronto, Canada, and built by the Leslie Brothers Company. It was so successful that Leslie snowplows are in use even today. Union Pacific has a Leslie plow that they house down in Rockland that they bring out during the biggest storms. I think the last time it was in use was in 2019. There is also a 1950s era Leslie plow that you can go see. It's housed in a pocket park just east of downtown Truckee along the tracks, along with a wrecking crane of similar vintage. Both pieces of equipment are owned and are being aesthetically restored by the Truckee-Donner Railroad Society, the same organization that operates this museum. So that brings us to the end of part one of the virtual tour, and now we'll move on to the central part of the museum with Nelson Van Gundy. Thank you.
I'm Nelson Van Gundy. I'm the historian for the Truckee-Donner Railroad Society. There were a couple of significant events in Western history which led to the huge amount of logging that occurred in the Truckee, Tahoe area. And the first was the Comstock lode, where gold miners from California discovered silver in and around Virginia City, Nevada, right southeast of Reno. And that led to the beginning of the logging industry in this general area, because those mines were, of course, everything was steam powered and wood fired, so they burned trillions of cords of wood to keep the mines and the mills operating. And then Virginia City's still standing on some of those timbers that were cut around here. And then the second major event, of course, was the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And just a few feet from where we're standing here in the museum's caboose is the site of the original Truckee Lumber Company, where most of the bulk of the ties and bridge timbers were processed from logs that were cut in the Truckee vicinity and used on the Transcontinental Railroad, and then on various of the other railroads in the region, as far away as Utah and Idaho and Oregon. One of the major operations was the Hobart Estates, Hobart Mills, which was an outgrowth of the Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber Company in Incline Village, which had developed during the Comstock. And then when it began to expand, they came to Hobart Mills, 6 miles north of Truckee. And this display is a quick demonstration of some of what went on there. They began with, before railroads, with just skid roads where horses and oxen would pull loads of trails of logs down the logs to the mill to be processed. And then later on they gradually changed to railroading. And one of the things they did, standard gauge railroads are 4 feet 8.5 inches, and that's what the Transcontinental was, and still is. But that was expensive to build, so they built narrow gauge, most of it 3-foot gauge. And we've got a display here that shows the difference in those two. And notice that the 3-foot gauge rails are much lighter also. And the way it worked is they would lay a line in to an area they wanted to log, log it, then pick up the rail and go lay it somewhere else. And some of this rail got laid a dozen times on these operations, certainly on the Hobart. Okay, this is the map from David Myrick's original publication, Railroads of Nevada and Eastern California, Volume 1, published originally in 1963 by the University of California Press, and then republished in '93 by the UNR Press, University of Nevada, Reno Press. And this is all of the railroad lines between Truckee and the Sierra Valley, which is only 30 miles away. And there were over 500 miles of logging lines in that area. And they literally cut trillions of board feet, most of it sugar pine, which was clear and strong and easy to work. And we have traced shipments of sugar pine. Most of these lines, the Hobart lines, were all narrow gauge, the 3-foot gauge, and then the Hobart Southern was a standard gauge line from the mills at Hobart to Truckee, connecting with the Transcontinental Railroad, and thus shipping the timber worldwide, initially to San Francisco, but eventually all over the world. And as I said, trillions of board feet. The head forester at Louisiana Pacific, well, who's now gone, but was very instrumental in my learning about a lot of this, Hank Schwartz, made the comment that 160 years ago these woods were 75–80% sugar pine, and now, because of the logging and mostly clear cutting, they're 12–15% sugar pine. If you're in an area and the trees are all the same height, you know that it was clear cut, some of that 130 years ago, some of it only 90 years ago. Anyway, this whole description of the Hobart operation, there were at one time 6 mills at Hobart. As I said, they shipped trillions of board feet out of there worldwide. Okay, this was one of the major operations in the entire West Coast. We have here a wonderful diorama of the logging industry built by Ron Mason as a display for this museum. Here is the standard gauge line hauling logs, and then complete with a steam donkey, which is how they powered the loading. And here's another steam donkey which pulled the logs in, yarded is the term they used, yarded the logs in to be loaded. And then up here's a narrow gauge line demonstrating how they built out through the woods with the smaller rails and tighter gauge that we discussed earlier. Okay, one of the major logging operations to supply lumber for the Comstock was D.L. Bliss's line out of Glenbrook on the east shore of Lake Tahoe, where he actually hauled logs from all around Lake Tahoe and milled at Glenbrook, and then hauled up to Spooner Summit and flumed them to Carson City, where then the Virginia and Truckee Railroad picked up the lumber and hauled it to Virginia City. By the late 1890s, the Comstock had pretty well shut down, so he picked up his logging line, which was narrow gauge, and brought it and laid it from Truckee up the Truckee River Canyon to Tahoe City, and thus invented tourism at Lake Tahoe. Up until then, it was only the rich folks that had access to Tahoe. Well, he built that line, and then of course the Southern Pacific Railroad was very interested in cooperating with him to bring people as far as Truckee, transfer them to the Lake Tahoe Railway and Transportation Company line in Truckee, up the Truckee River to Tahoe City, and then ride his steamboats, which he'd pulled logs behind for 30 years and had converted to passenger service. So he went all the way around Lake Tahoe delivering people to various places that they could entertain themselves on Tahoe. It's a very interesting fact that he developed the Tahoe tourism industry, which is now pretty much the reason that Truckee is still here and that Lake Tahoe is as busy as it is. One of the developments in concert with that is we've got here a model, or actually a roomette from the design is almost 90 years ago, for the 1930s, but this is how people rode on the Southern Pacific from all across the country to come to Truckee and then convert to the narrow gauge line to go to Tahoe City. And then in 1926, the Southern Pacific bought the narrow gauge line and converted it to standard gauge so they could run the standard gauge cars all the way to Tahoe City, and that lasted into World War II. Okay?
Great. Thank you.
Got adequate